Welcome to Horror Echo. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from and the time. Now, relax and join me on a journey into the unknown. Ocean's Grip, 10 Chapters of Terror Beneath the Waves. Chapter 1, The Silent Call. It was supposed to be a simple dive, one of many. The crew aboard the Siren Song had been on this route for years, exploring the depths off the coast of a remote, unnamed island. Divers had come here countless times to examine the untouched waters, the dark blue depths, and the wrecks of ships long lost to time. But this dive was different. This time, something was waiting. Captain Ethan Jones, a seasoned sailor with decades of experience, had seen many things, storms that came out of nowhere, wreckage that seemed too perfectly arranged to be natural, and the occasional unease in the eyes of his crew. But as they approached the island that morning, a strange silence filled the air, a weighty stillness that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. There was no wind. The sea was unnaturally calm, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. "Something's not right," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. But the crew, a collection of veteran divers and underwater archaeologists, laughed it off. They'd been to more dangerous places. The ocean had always been unpredictable. However, as they prepared the gear, something felt off. Every diver noticed it, the slight chill in the air, the peculiar echo of their movements, as if the ocean itself was listening. Even Clara, the lead diver, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "All right, team," Clara said, shaking off the unease. "Let's make this quick. We've got the wreck of the Ephraim, a mid-19th century merchant ship, waiting for us down there. Let's see what secrets she holds." The crew nodded and descended into the ocean, the water swallowing them whole as they plunged deeper. The light from the surface soon faded, replaced by the eerie glow of their dive lights. The sea was darker than they remembered, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. As they descended, Clara led the team through the murky depths, their lights flickering against the dark, oily water. At first, the only sounds were the soft hums of their equipment and the rhythmic bubbles of their breathing. But as they neared the wreck, something changed. The water grew colder, and the silence deepened. There were no fish, no sea life. It was as if everything in the ocean had fled. When they finally reached the wreck, the Ephraim was barely recognizable. Its once proud hull had been eaten away by time and the sea, its timbers now nothing more than jagged skeletons of their former selves. The wreck sat on the ocean floor, encrusted with barnacles and coral, and surrounded by a thick fog of silt that seemed to hang in the water unnaturally. Clara approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something wrong about this place. The shipwreck, though fascinating, seemed too perfect, as though it had been placed here deliberately. She motioned for the team to spread out and begin their exploration. But as she moved closer to the stern of the ship, something caught her eye. A glint. It wasn't a piece of wreckage or coral, it was something shiny, almost metallic, buried just beneath the sand. She signaled to one of the divers, Tom, to come over. Tom swam over, his light illuminating the area. Together, they dug carefully at the sand, uncovering an old, tarnished box. It was made of brass, intricately etched with designs that didn't resemble anything from the 19th century. There was a strange, almost hypnotic energy surrounding it. "What do you think this is?" Tom asked, his voice muffled through the communicator. "I'm not sure," Clara replied, unease creeping into her voice. "But it doesn't belong here." They tried to lift the box, but it felt unusually heavy for its size. It was as though the ocean was holding it in place, as if it didn't want them to take it. Clara's pulse quickened as a strange vibration seemed to pulse through the water around them. It wasn't from their equipment, this was something deeper, something ancient. The team continued to work together, but the unease only grew. Clara's breathing grew shallow as she felt something more than just the cold in the water. A pressure seemed to build around them, pressing in from all sides. It wasn't the usual weight of the ocean, it was as though the very sea itself was closing in on them. Suddenly, a voice crackled through her earpiece, distorted and faint, as though coming from far away. At first, it was unintelligible, but then a word broke through. Leave. Clara froze. The word was clear. It wasn't a malfunction. She wasn't imagining it. Did anyone else hear that? She asked, her voice shaky. The team responded almost immediately, but all their communicators were filled with static. A strange, high-pitched hum resonated in their ears, so loud that it was impossible to hear anything else. Clara, get the box out of there, Tom urged, his voice trembling. But Clara couldn't move. The water around them seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light, and her hand, frozen over the box, wouldn't obey. Her fingers tingled, as if a strange force was gripping them, forcing them to leave it alone. The sea wasn't just cold, it was alive. It was breathing. Then, a sound, a low, rumbling groan, echoed through the water. It was a deep, guttural noise, like the growl of something massive, something ancient. The ocean itself seemed to respond, its currents beginning to churn violently. Clara, we need to go, Tom shouted, his voice filled with panic. Before she could respond, the water around them erupted in a violent, swirling vortex. It was as if the sea itself had come alive, pulling at them with unnatural force. Divers were tossed about like rag dolls, and Clara's heart raced as she tried to steady herself. The box, once heavy, now seemed to be pulling her down. It was dragging her deeper, into the wreck, into the waiting dark abyss of the ocean. For a brief moment, everything went dark. The water grew cold, colder than it had ever been before, and Clara felt a pressure unlike anything she had ever experienced. She could barely breathe as the weight of the water surrounded her, constricting her lungs. And then, there was silence. The world around her was still, as if frozen in time. Clara opened her eyes and looked around, only to find herself alone in the wreck. The other divers were gone, no lights, no movement, just the eerie stillness of the ocean. But then, something caught her eye. A figure, moving in the shadows of the wreck. A face, pale and distorted, staring at her through the darkness. It wasn't human. It was a creature of the deep, its eyes black voids that seemed to reach into her very soul. And then, in a voice that wasn't her own, Clara heard the words again, this time loud and clear. Leave, before you become one of us. The ocean had claimed them, and it wasn't going to let them go. Chapter 2, The Blackened Tide. The siren's song crept. The weather had changed with an eerie suddenness, from clear skies to an oppressive grayness. The wind had died completely, leaving the ocean unnaturally calm. But beneath the surface, there was something moving. The currents were unpredictable, erratic. No matter how much the crew tried to control the course, the ship began to veer. Captain, called Tom, the first mate, his voice filled with unease. I don't like this. The currents, something's wrong. Ethan didn't respond at first. He had been sailing the seas for decades, and he could sense when things were about to turn. The sea, it seemed, had been waiting for them. And now that it had their attention, it was beginning to show its true power. Just keep your eyes on the water. Don't trust anything you see, Ethan muttered. The air was thick, the atmosphere charged with a strange, suffocating energy. The crew members who had been working on deck began to feel it too. The silence, the way the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, began to close in on them, like a predator circling its prey. The ship's engines were running sluggishly, the sound of their hum oddly muffled, and the radar kept flickering in and out of functionality. Every time it turned on, there was nothing, no indication of land, no other ships, no sign of life. Then, out of nowhere, came a rumble, so low it vibrated through the deck and into their bones. The sea began to churn. At first, it was subtle, like the ocean was testing the ship, but within moments, it escalated. Waves began to rise around them, dark and ominous, their surfaces streaked with something black. "Where's this coming from?" Tom shouted over the roaring wind that had suddenly kicked up. The waves were now crashing violently against the hull, yet the sky above remained in unnerving stillness. "Hold on," Ethan ordered, gripping the wheel as the siren's song lurched to the side. The ship was fighting against the relentless pull of the sea, but there was something more at play here. Something unnatural. As they navigated the darkening waters, the crew noticed a strange phenomenon. The ocean, despite the storm's fury, seemed to be filled with a thick, oily blackness. The waves themselves were tainted, rolling in like an endless tide of ink, slick and viscous. It wasn't the usual churn of the ocean. This felt like something deeper, darker. "Captain, look," shouted one of the crew members, pointing to the horizon where a dense fog had begun to roll in from all sides, enveloping the ship like a suffocating blanket. "No!" Ethan barked. "No fog. Don't let it surround us." But it was already too late. The mist was thick, and no one could see beyond the immediate surroundings of the ship. It felt as if the ship itself was drifting, no longer in control, being pulled into something vast and ancient. Tom stood beside Ethan, his hands gripping the rail, eyes scanning the horizon. "This isn't a normal storm, is it?" "Nothing about this is normal," Ethan replied, his voice steady but filled with unease. The crew had heard the stories, the old sailors' tales that spoke of a cursed part of the ocean, a stretch of water where the sea itself seemed to rise in anger. Many had ventured near, but none had ever returned. They called it the Blackened Tide. Suddenly, a scream cut through the air. It was Jennifer, a young deckhand, who had been standing near the bow, looking into the distance. When the crew turned to her, she was staring into the water, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "There's something down there," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Something moving beneath the waves. It's watching us." The others rushed to her side, but before they could get a clear look, the water surged violently, splashing against the deck. The ship tilted dangerously, sending crew members stumbling to the ground. And then, the water seemed to erupt. From the depths, a massive shape rose, something vast and incomprehensible, with black tendrils writhing in every direction. The crew stood frozen, their eyes locked on the monstrous silhouette, only visible through the thick fog and the unrelenting black tide. "Get below deck!" Ethan roared, snapping the crew out of their stupor. "Now!" But it was already too late. The ship was caught in the grip of something far beyond their control. The tendrils of blackness reached out, coiling around the ship's hull, pulling it downward. A loud, deafening crash erupted as the ship's hull began to splinter, and the blackened tide rose higher, pulling the siren's song closer to the depths. As the crew scrambled to save themselves, the world around them was consumed by darkness. The waves raged and tore at the ship, drowning their cries. And in the distance, the faint sound of a low, rumbling growl echoed across the water, coming from deep beneath the ocean's surface. The sea had claimed another ship. and with it, another crew. Chapter 3: The Deep Beneath. Dr. Evelyn Hayes had always been drawn to the sea, not just for the research, but for the endless mysteries it held beneath the surface. As a marine biologist, her fascination with the ocean's depths went beyond curiosity. It was a passion that consumed her. This expedition was supposed to be a groundbreaking one, a mission to study the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the world's oceans, and perhaps discover new species that had never been seen before by human eyes. But no one had ever prepared her for what she was about to uncover. The Abyssal Voyager was a state-of-the-art submersible, built to withstand the crushing pressures of the deep. It had been designed for the most advanced research, but there was something strange about this mission, something that Evelyn couldn't quite put her finger on. The crew was small, just a handful of scientists and technicians, but it wasn't their skills or knowledge that made Evelyn uneasy. It was the unspoken tension between them, the way they avoided looking at her, as if they knew something she didn't. The descent into the trench began without incident. The submersible's powerful lights cut through the inky blackness, casting eerie shadows on the seafloor as they slowly descended. Evelyn watched the readings on her monitor, each passing meter bringing them closer to the unknown. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became. It wasn't the usual stillness of the deep sea. This felt alive. The water around them was thick with something invisible, a presence that seemed to be watching, waiting. "Everything looks good," the captain, Greg, called back from the cockpit, his voice breaking through the eerie quiet. "We're nearing the trench floor. Are you ready, Dr. Hayes?" Evelyn nodded, though the knot in her stomach was growing tighter by the second. She had always been prepared for the unknown, but this felt different. There was something wrong in the deep. The lights flickered once, then twice. Evelyn glanced up at the console. "That's odd," she muttered. "Power levels are normal." "Don't worry about it," Greg said, trying to reassure her. "It's probably just a glitch." But Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being pulled down, not just by gravity, but by something much more powerful. The trench floor was now just a few hundred meters below them, but the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden jolt, a violent shake that rattled the entire submersible. "Hold on!" Greg shouted, his hands tight on the controls as the submersible lurched forward. The lights flickered again, and the ocean outside seemed to grow even darker. "What the hell is that?" one of the other scientists, Karen, shouted, pointing to the screen in front of her. Evelyn's eyes followed her gaze, and her blood ran cold. There, in the distance, just outside the range of their lights, something moved. A shadow. But it wasn't the shape of any known creature. It was massive, far larger than anything they had expected to encounter down here. And it was moving toward them. "Get us out of here!" Evelyn screamed, her heart pounding in her chest. But it was too late. The shadow was upon them. The submersible was caught in an unnatural current, twisting and pulling them deeper, faster than they could comprehend. The walls of the trench seemed to close in on them, the water growing colder with each passing second. Evelyn could hear the rapid, panicked breathing of the crew around her as the lights dimmed again, leaving them in near complete darkness. Then, the rumbling began. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a sound too deep for anything above the sea to understand, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the very metal of the submersible. The walls seemed to tremble as the noise intensified, and Evelyn could feel her chest tightening, as though the pressure was not just from the water, but from something more. "Turn the lights back on," Greg shouted, his voice filled with fear. "I'm trying," Karen yelled, desperately working the controls. But the submersible's lights refused to come back on, leaving them in complete darkness, save for the faint glow of the emergency lights. The growl grew louder, closer. It was no longer coming from the depths of the trench, it was coming from all around them. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as a figure moved just beyond their line of sight. It was massive, its form shifting in the shadows, its presence suffocating. It was something alive, something ancient, something that had been lurking at the bottom of the trench for millennia. Evelyn's eyes strained to see, her mind racing. "What is that?" she whispered. But no one could answer. The only sound now was the increasing hum of the submersible's engines, struggling against the pull of the current. It was a fight they were losing. And then, suddenly, the submersible lurched to the side, throwing everyone against the walls. They were plunged into darkness as the emergency lights flickered and died. The rumbling stopped, but the oppressive silence was worse than any noise. It was as if the ocean itself had gone still, holding its breath, waiting for something. Seconds passed, then minutes. No one moved, too afraid to speak, to even breathe. The tension in the air was palpable. And then, from the depths, something began to rise. A dark shape, immense, otherworldly, suddenly loomed over them, blotting out everything. Evelyn could feel its presence, even before she saw it. It was the same shape she had glimpsed before, the one that had been following them. But this time, it was close enough to touch, to consume them. It was alive. And it wasn't alone. From the deep, it reached out with tentacles that stretched far longer than any known creature should possess. They pressed against the submersible, their tips scraping the hull, as though feeling for weakness. The submersible groaned under the pressure, and the crew's panic reached a fever pitch. "What is it?" Greg whispered, barely able to form words. His voice cracked under the strain of terror. Evelyn had no answer. Her eyes darted around, searching for a way out, but there was no escape. The darkness outside was now teeming with shadows, all moving toward them, all closing in. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the pressure was released. The shape retreated, leaving only the echo of its presence behind. The current eased, and the submersible was once again free to move, but no one dared to touch the controls. The crew sat frozen, too afraid to speak, too terrified to look outside. The ocean had shown them a glimpse of its true depths. But the worst was yet to come. Chapter 4, Echoes in the Dark. The luxury yacht Elysium cut through the water with grace, its sleek hull gliding over the calm sea. For most of the crew, this was another routine voyage. A group of wealthy tourists had booked the yacht for a week-long cruise along the coast, wanting to experience the thrill of open waters and exotic locations. Captain Malcolm Torres had been sailing for years, and the Elysium was his pride and joy. The passengers were eager to explore hidden islands, pristine beaches, and quiet coves, but the weather had other plans. The morning had started just like any other, with bright sunshine and clear skies. But by afternoon, the atmosphere began to change. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, grew unnervingly still. The sea, which had been smooth as glass, began to stir with an unnatural quietness. The yacht's engines hummed softly, but there was something about the silence that felt wrong, as though the world itself had momentarily held its breath. "Everything's fine, folks," Captain Torres said, giving the passengers a reassuring smile as he adjusted the wheel. "Just a bit of a calm before the storm, but we're heading toward a secluded island. A little adventure, and then we can relax." His voice was steady, but there was a subtle tremor in his hands as he gripped the wheel. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, a perfect line of blue where the ocean met the sky, and yet there was a weight in the air, a tension that seemed to grow with every passing moment. As the yacht drifted further from the shore, the feeling of isolation became more pronounced. The passengers, once excited about the adventure ahead, began to grow uneasy. One by one, they retreated to their cabins, leaving the deck empty except for the crew. Even the crew, usually confident and composed, seemed on edge. First Mate Emily stood at the railing, staring out into the distance, her eyes narrowed as if searching for something she couldn't see. "What's wrong, Emily?" Torres asked, his voice laced with concern. "There's something out there," she said softly, her eyes still locked on the endless blue expanse. "I can't explain it, but something's not right." Before Torres could respond, a sudden, sharp crack pierced the silence, a sound that sent a chill down their spines. It wasn't the creaking of the ship, it was a sharp, almost metallic sound, like something snapping under pressure. The entire ship seemed to vibrate with it, the reverberations traveling through the metal hull. "What the hell was that?" Torres muttered, rushing over to the deck. His eyes scanned the waters, searching for any sign of what had caused the noise. And then, they saw it. Out of the corner of their eyes, a shadow, huge, dark, and formless, slid just beneath the surface of the water. It was fleeting, almost too fast to notice, but unmistakable. A ripple stretched across the water in its wake, but it didn't match the usual patterns of wind or waves. "It can't be," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's too big to be a whale." Torres didn't answer. His mind raced as he scanned the horizon, the strange sensation in the air growing stronger with every passing second. The shadow had vanished beneath the water, but the feeling it left behind lingered. It was as though the ocean itself had shifted, like something ancient, something powerful, had just stirred from its slumber. Suddenly, the yacht's radar flickered to life, its screen showing nothing but a vast emptiness. But then, in the very center of the screen, a small blip appeared. A faint, pulsing signal, coming from deep beneath the surface. "It's not possible," Torres murmured, his brow furrowing. The signal didn't make sense. It was far deeper than any submarine could go, far deeper than even the most advanced sonar could reach. Before he could process what it meant, the water around the yacht began to change. A thick fog rolled in, clouding the horizon and cutting visibility down to almost nothing. The wind picked up, whipping through the sails and snapping the rigging like a whip. It came from nowhere, a sudden storm that appeared without warning, swirling around the yacht with a ferocity that made the crew stumble. "Get inside! Now!" Torres shouted. The crew scrambled to obey, fear flooding their faces as the fog thickened, turning the world around them into a swirling gray nightmare. But as the passengers and crew retreated to the interior, one person, a young woman named Sarah, refused to leave the deck. She stood at the railing, gazing into the fog, as though drawn to something on the other side. She could hear something, a sound, faint but persistent, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from deep within the water. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. No one answered. The others had already retreated, leaving her alone, standing at the edge of the boat. The wail grew louder, a sound that resonated deep within her chest, as though it was coming from the very soul of the ocean itself. The fog parted momentarily, and in that brief instant, Sarah saw it. A shape, dark and twisted, moving just beneath the surface, its form stretching and shifting in ways that defied reason. It was massive, far larger than the yacht itself, and its silhouette seemed to blur and distort as if it were not entirely part of this world. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly, like deep, dark pools that seemed to peer into her very being. A voice echoed through the fog, deep and guttural, coming from all around her. It wasn't words, not exactly, but the sound felt like a command, a beckoning, a pull that couldn't be ignored. Join us. Before she could react, the yacht lurched violently. The deck tilted as if the ship had been caught in some invisible force, sending Sarah stumbling. She grabbed the railing to steady herself, but the boat groaned as it was dragged toward the water. The fog thickened again, and the sound of the wail turned into a chorus, dozens of voices rising from the depths. Panic set in. The ship was moving, but not under its own power. Something was dragging it, pulling it toward the ocean's depths. "Help!" Sarah screamed, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of sound. The yacht's engines roared to life, fighting against the unseen force that threatened to pull them all into the water. Then, the fog parted once more, and for a moment, there was a horrifying clarity. The shadow in the water was no longer a distant figure, it was right below them, its form massive and dark, as though the ocean itself was rising up to consume them. The sea parted as something enormous surged upward from the depths, its shape like that of a great, writhing serpent. Its mouth, gaping and endless, opened wide as it lunged toward the yacht, the crew screaming in terror as they scrambled to abandon ship. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the ocean fell silent again. The fog receded, the winds died down, and the Elysium drifted aimlessly in the calm waters. But Sarah was gone. The crew was gone. The ocean had claimed them. And in the distance, just beyond the reach of the yacht's fading lights, a pair of glowing eyes watched. Chapter 5: The Drowned Town. It had been days since the Elysium was lost to the sea, but the memories of that day, of the wailing voices, the monstrous serpent, and the ship's sudden disappearance, still haunted the survivors. The crew of the Orion, a small research vessel that had been dispatched to search for the Elysium, found themselves sailing through the same waters where it had vanished. The sea was unnervingly calm, a glassy mirror stretching to the horizon, with no sign of any wreckage or debris. The ocean had swallowed it whole. Captain James Archer stood at the helm of the Orion, watching the waters closely. His team had been trying to decipher what had happened to the yacht, but every lead they had followed had turned into nothing more than dead ends. Still, they pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. "Captain, we should take a look at the coordinates," said Dr. Fiona Reyes, a marine geologist. She had been studying the sonar readings on the ship's monitors. "There's something strange here. The depth readings are inconsistent. It's as if the ocean floor is shifting." James frowned. "Shifting? That doesn't make sense. The sea floor doesn't just shift." "I know," Fiona said, her voice tinged with unease. "But the readings are clear. It's like the bottom of the ocean isn't stable here. Look at this." James leaned over the console, watching the sonar screen flash with irregular patterns. Beneath them, the sea seemed to be hiding something, something large, something old. "We need to get closer," James said, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "Whatever it is, we're going to find it." The team descended into silence as the ship approached the coordinates. The air was thick with tension, the water stretching out before them like an endless, empty abyss. The fog had rolled in again, thick and heavy, obscuring their view. They could barely see the bow of the ship through the haze. The sea was unnaturally still, but there was an undeniable sense of something watching them, something waiting just beyond the horizon. "Bring up the sonar," James ordered, his voice commanding as he tried to cut through the oppressive atmosphere. The technician on duty, Carlos, pushed a few buttons and pulled up the scan. The screen blinked. "Nothing." "Try again," James said, his patience thinning. There was no way they could be this close to something that large without getting a reading. Carlos adjusted the settings and initiated another scan, but this time, the sonar screen did more than blink. It lit up like a Christmas tree. There's something massive down there, Carlos exclaimed, pointing to the glowing red readings. Whatever it is, it's huge. It's almost as big as a city block. Is it moving? Fiona asked, her voice filled with concern. No, Carlos said, his tone grim. It's stationary. Whatever this thing is, it's sitting on the ocean floor. And it's not normal. The crew gathered around the monitor, all of them trying to make sense of the situation. It was clear that the ocean was hiding something, something that hadn't been discovered before. But what could it be? A shipwreck? A submerged natural formation? James could feel his pulse quickening as he stared at the readings. The idea of a massive, stationary object lying on the ocean floor, something so huge it could not be identified by sonar, was unnerving. But the worst part was the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. They were close. Too close. We need to investigate, James said, his voice tight with unease. Get the submersible ready. We're going down. Fiona shot him a look, but said nothing. She knew better than to argue when James had made up his mind. The Orion submersible was one of the best in its class, designed to withstand the crushing depths of the ocean. The descent was going to be difficult, but the crew had no choice. The unknown was calling them down, and there was no turning back. As the submersible descended into the murky depths, the crew watched in silence. The water around them was thick with silt, and the lights from the submersible barely cut through the darkness. The sonar readings remained consistent, guiding them toward the mysterious object on the ocean floor. Minutes passed. Then hours. The pressure mounted, and with each meter they descended, the feeling of unease intensified. The deeper they went, the colder the water became, until it felt like an icy grip around their bodies. Finally, the submersible's lights cut through the silt, revealing the shadow of something large and broken. It wasn't a natural formation. It was man-made. The wreckage of what appeared to be an ancient town sprawled out before them, its buildings collapsed and half submerged in the sand, but still intact enough to be recognizable. That's impossible, Fiona whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. How could a town have sunk here, in the middle of the ocean? James stared at the wreckage, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. It's not possible. This show. The submersible's lights flickered as they approached the remains of a stone building, its facade crumbling but still standing. Carved into the stones were strange symbols, symbols that none of them recognized. The markings seemed familiar in a way that sent chills down James's spine. What is this place? Carlos asked, his voice shaky. This is no shipwreck. This is a town. As they explored further, they uncovered more of the eerie remains, buildings, streets, and even what looked like the remnants of old statues. The deeper they went into the ruins, the more unsettled they became. The town had been abandoned long ago, but something about it felt wrong. There was a presence in the air, something lingering in the water that made their skin crawl. The silence around them was deafening, the only sounds coming from their breathing and the soft hum of the submersible's engines. And then they found it. In the center of the town, partially buried beneath the sand, lay a massive stone structure. It was circular, its edges adorned with the same strange symbols they had seen earlier. As the submersible's lights illuminated it, they could make out what appeared to be a doorway, though it was sealed shut. What the hell is this? Fiona whispered, her voice trembling. It looks like a temple. But to what? Before anyone could respond, The submersible's lights flickered once again, and the temperature dropped. The water around them seemed to grow colder, as if the ocean itself was reacting to their discovery. The silence turned into a low hum, a vibrating sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the ocean. Suddenly, the submersible jolted violently, sending the crew tumbling into the walls. The systems began to shut down, and the screens blinked erratically. "What's happening?" Carlos shouted, his voice panicked. "We're losing power," James said, his voice steady but laced with fear. "We need to get out of here, now." But it was too late. As the submersible began to rise, the dark shape beneath them stirred. The entire town, submerged for centuries, seemed to come alive. The water around them began to swirl, and the hum from the depths grew louder. And then, with a roar that shook the very ocean, something massive erupted from the depths below. The ancient town, long buried beneath the ocean's surface, was not just a town, it was a tomb. And whatever had been waiting inside had just awoken. Chapter 6: The Sea Serpent's Curse. The Orion was no longer a place of calm or safety. The moment the ancient town had stirred beneath the ocean's depths, something changed. The crew was shaken, their nerves stretched thin by the strange events that had unfolded. But they had no choice but to continue, to press on into the unknown. They had come too far to turn back now, and the promise of discovery, the promise of answers, was too strong. James sat in the captain's chair, staring at the fog outside. The fog had not lifted since their descent into the cursed waters, and now, with the unease of the sunken town fresh in their minds, the fog seemed to be growing thicker, pressing in on them. He could feel it, as if the ocean itself were watching them, waiting for them to make a move. "Captain," Fiona called from the navigation table. Her voice was sharp, breaking through his thoughts. "You need to see this." James stood and walked over to the screen she was working on. She had been monitoring the sonar closely after their return to the surface, but the readings were becoming increasingly erratic. As he leaned over her shoulder, he saw the blinking red dots on the screen. "Are we close to the town again?" he asked, frowning. "No," Fiona replied. "But we're close to something else. The sonar is picking up an anomaly. It's large, bigger than anything we've encountered so far. And it's moving." "A moving object?" James's brow furrowed in confusion. Could it be a shipwreck? Or another structure? "No," Fiona said, her voice lowering. "It's something far larger. Something alive." The realization hit James like a punch to the gut. He had heard the stories, the ancient sailors' tales, the ones that spoke of a massive sea serpent that haunted the waters of this region, a creature so old and terrifying that its very name had been erased from history. Legend spoke of it as a harbinger of doom, a beast that would rise from the depths to claim ships and sailors alike. He had dismissed the stories at first, thinking them to be nothing more than the fantastical ramblings of sailors lost to superstition. But now, after everything they had encountered, those stories no longer seemed so distant. "Prepare the submersible," James said, his voice low and determined. "We need to investigate. We can't afford to ignore this." The crew was on edge, their nerves taut as they made preparations. The submersible had barely been repaired from their previous dive, but they had no choice but to use it again. They had to know what was down there. The readings on the sonar suggested that whatever was lurking beneath them was closing in fast. As they descended into the dark waters once more, the crew remained silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the submersible's engines as they cut through the thick, suffocating darkness. The ocean felt different this time, more oppressive, as if the water itself were pulling at them. The temperature had dropped significantly since their last descent, and there was a strange vibration in the hull, an almost imperceptible hum that seemed to come from everywhere. The deeper they went, the more the tension grew. The water around them seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as though it were alive. The lights from the submersible barely pierced the darkness ahead, and every shadow felt like it was moving, shifting just beyond their reach. "There," Carlos said, pointing to the sonar screen. The red blips had become more concentrated, more distinct, and they were getting closer to the moving object. James could feel the pressure in the air, the sensation of something watching them, something waiting. "Keep going," he ordered, his voice tight. As they neared the source of the blips, the lights of the submersible flickered. At first, it was subtle, a brief flicker that lasted only a fraction of a second. But then, the lights went out entirely, leaving them in absolute darkness. "Shit!" Fiona shouted, her voice laced with panic. "We're losing power." James gripped the controls tightly, trying to bring the lights back on. His breath was shallow, his mind racing as he tried to assess the situation. But before he could respond, the entire submersible jolted violently, as if something enormous had struck it. The crew was thrown to the sides, the lights flickering back to life for a brief moment before they went out again. And then, from the depths, came the sound. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very heart of the ocean. It was unlike anything they had ever heard before, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the submersible, shaking them to their core. It was the sound of something ancient, something powerful, and it was close, too close. James tried to speak, but his voice was lost in the sound of the growl, which had become a roar. The submersible groaned under the pressure as the growl grew louder, now accompanied by a massive thrashing sound, as if something huge was moving just beneath them. "Look!" Carlos screamed, pointing frantically out the viewing port. A massive shape, black as midnight, loomed just beyond the submersible, its form so vast that it nearly blocked out the entire view. It was the shape of a serpent, but not like any serpent they had ever seen. It was enormous, its body twisting and undulating in the water, its scales gleaming like polished obsidian. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were glowing, faint and menacing, like twin pools of dark liquid, peering into the submersible with an intelligence that sent chills down James's spine. "No, no," Fiona whispered, her voice trembling. "It can't be real. This is impossible." But it was real. The sea serpent was here. And it was coming for them. The submersible was caught in its massive coils, the pressure increasing as the serpent wrapped around them, dragging them deeper into the abyss. The crew screamed, their voices drowned out by the deafening roar of the creature's movements. The walls of the submersible creaked under the strain, and the lights flickered once again, casting brief, ghostly glimpses of the creature outside. James slammed his hand on the emergency release button, but it was no use. The serpent's power was too great. The submersible was now at its mercy, helpless against the ancient creature that had been waiting for them in the depths. The water around them turned colder, and the pressure intensified. The creature's eyes glowed brighter as it dragged them deeper, its massive body sliding over the submersible, its scales scraping against the hull with a sound like grinding stone. The vibrations from its movements filled the submersible, making it impossible to think, impossible to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature released its grip. The submersible was free, but for how long? As they ascended, James could feel the weight of the ocean pressing in on them. The serpent had let them go, but the price was yet to be paid. They had disturbed something ancient, something that had no intention of letting them leave. The water around them was still, the silence deafening. But James knew they were not alone. The serpent was out there, watching them, waiting for its chance to strike again. Chapter 7: The Wailing Coast. The Orion had narrowly escaped the grip of the sea serpent, its crew shaken but alive. The ocean, once a place of wonder and scientific exploration, had become a realm of terror and ancient, malevolent forces. Despite the harrowing encounter with the serpent, James knew there was no turning back now. The ocean had shown its true face, and whatever lay ahead could be just as deadly. They had come to a stretch of coastline, known only in old maritime legends as the Wailing Coast. The name was enough to send a chill down the spine of any sailor familiar with the old tales, stories of wailing voices that drifted on the wind, of ships lost to unseen forces, of eerie lights that beckoned from the shore at night. No one who had ventured too close had ever returned to tell their tale, and those who had come back were often broken, shattered by the madness they had witnessed. The Orion was now anchored just off the coast, its crew divided. Some had heard the stories, and though they wanted to ignore the fear, there was an unease in the air that none of them could shake. The wind, though faint, carried with it a sound, one that was unmistakable. The faintest wail. "Do you hear that?" Carlos asked, his voice hushed, as he stood near the railing, listening intently. The wail seemed to ebb and flow, a distant, mournful cry that tugged at the very core of their being. "I don't know what it is," Fiona replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't think it's natural." James felt a strange compulsion to investigate, an instinct pulling him toward the shore despite the rising fear in his chest. There was something here, something buried deep in the legends of the Wailing Coast. Whatever it was, it called to them, beckoning them closer, as if it knew they were coming. "Prepare the dinghy," James ordered. "We'll investigate the source of the sound. But we're going in cautiously. No heroics. If anything feels off, we return immediately." The crew members, though uneasy, followed his orders. They piled into the dinghy, the small boat bobbing gently on the water as they made their way toward the shore. The closer they got, the stronger the wail became. It was as if it were rising from the very earth itself, echoing through the air like a chorus of tortured souls. As they approached the coast, the fog that had been creeping around the water grew thicker. It wasn't natural fog, either. There was something unnatural about it, a kind of heaviness that made the air feel suffocating. The shore was barely visible now, only a faint silhouette in the mist, but the wailing was clearer, louder. It felt like a physical presence, like something reaching out from the depths, trying to pull them in. "Stay close," James said, his voice tense. "I don't care how it sounds, don't split up." The dinghy scraped against the rocky shore, and they all climbed out, their feet sinking slightly into the soft sand. The wail echoed through the air, louder now, as if it were coming from deep within the earth. "It's not just the wind," Carlos said, his eyes wide with fear. "There's something out there. Something that's alive." James's heart pounded at his chest, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but his curiosity, and his need for answers, kept him moving forward. They stepped cautiously onto the rocky shore, their eyes scanning the fog-shrouded landscape. The wail grew louder with every step, yet the source remained unseen. As they walked, the shore seemed to stretch on forever. Jagged rocks jutted out of the sand like the broken teeth of some ancient creature. The fog clung to everything, casting long, shifting shadows that played tricks on their eyes. At times, it felt as though the ground beneath them was shifting, moving, as though the very coastline was alive. "There's something ahead," Fiona whispered, pointing to the faint outline of a structure in the distance. It looked like the remnants of an old lighthouse, but there was no sign of light. Just a silhouette, dark against the fog. The wailing grew louder as they approached. It wasn't just a cry anymore. It was as if something was calling to them, beckoning them to come closer, to listen. The sound tugged at their hearts, filling them with a mixture of dread and desperation. It felt like a siren's song, but instead of luring them toward beauty or peace, it was pulling them into darkness. When they reached the lighthouse, it was even worse than they had imagined. The structure, though old and crumbling, still stood tall against the encroaching fog. The door to the lighthouse was ajar, and the wail seemed to emanate from within, its mournful sound vibrating through the very walls. James hesitated for only a moment before pushing open the door. The inside was dark, the air thick with dust and mildew. The walls were lined with remnants of old, rusted equipment and discarded debris. But the wail, it was clearer now. It was louder. It seemed to be coming from deep below the lighthouse. "What is that?" Carlos asked, his voice shaking with fear. "I don't know," James replied, though his own voice was strained. "But we're about to find out." They moved down a spiral staircase, each step creaking under their weight, until they reached a lower level. It was then that the air grew colder, the temperature dropping with each step. The wail was no longer a sound, it was a presence. It pressed against them, forcing them to stop, to listen. And then, as they reached the bottom of the stairs, they saw it. The ground beneath them was cracked open, revealing a gaping hole, a dark abyss that seemed to stretch down into nothingness. The wail was coming from within the hole, as though it were being produced by something trapped far beneath the earth. But it was not just the sound that struck them, it was the sight. At the edge of the abyss, there were shapes, shadows, masses of writhing figures, twisted and disfigured. The figures seemed to pulse and twitch, their movements erratic and unnatural, as though they were fighting against some unseen force. There was no doubt now, they were not human. They were something else, something old, something cursed. Fiona gasped, her hand covering her mouth as she stepped back in terror. "What are they?" "They're not alive," Carlos whispered. "They're trapped." The figures in the abyss seemed to reach toward them, their twisted arms stretching out, grasping for freedom. Their faces were contorted in agony, their mouths opened in silent screams, but no sound emerged. It was as if they were eternally caught in their torment. The wail intensified, becoming a deafening roar, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. The walls of the lighthouse shook, and dust rained down from the ceiling. James's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the truth. The wailing voices, the twisted figures, they were not just the remnants of some ancient curse. They were souls, trapped in the depths, bound by a force far older and more malevolent than they could ever understand. The ground beneath them cracked open further, and James knew they had no time left. They had to leave. They had to escape. "Get out!" "Now," he shouted, grabbing Fiona's arm and pulling her toward the staircase. But it was too late. The abyss had come to life. The figures were moving now, crawling out of the hole, their twisted forms reaching for them with terrifying speed. "Run!" James screamed, but his voice was lost in the roar of the wail. As they sprinted back up the stairs, the very ground beneath their feet seemed to break apart. The lighthouse was collapsing, its foundations cracking under the pressure of the cursed souls rising from below. James and the crew barely made it out, the door slamming shut behind them, but the wailing followed them, echoing in the fog, a sound that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And as they stumbled back to the dinghy, James could feel it, the presence of something ancient, something evil, watching them from the depths of the wailing coast. It wasn't over. Chapter 8, The Silent Abyss. The Orion had left the wailing coast behind, but the air was still thick with the weight of what they had witnessed. The cries of the trapped souls, the twisting figures reaching out from the abyss, haunted their minds. The crew was quieter now, as if the terror they had encountered on that cursed shore had drained them of any sense of security. They had been forced to abandon their investigation into the lighthouse and the wailing souls, but James knew that the true horror had only just begun. As the ship sailed away from the coast, the fog began to clear, but the unease did not. The ocean around them was unnaturally still, a vast, empty expanse that seemed to stretch on forever. There were no fish in the waters, no movement beneath the surface, only a profound silence that felt suffocating. It was as if the sea itself had withdrawn into a deep slumber, waiting for something. "We're too far from the shore to turn back now," Fiona said, her voice strained. "But I feel like we've entered another kind of void. The calm here isn't right." James didn't answer immediately. He was staring out at the vast horizon, his eyes narrowing. The ocean had been eerily still ever since they had left the Wailing Coast, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something vast, something that had been waiting for them. "Captain," Carlos called from the radar room. "We've got a strange reading." James's heart skipped a beat. He had expected something like this. The ocean had been too quiet for too long. He stepped quickly into the radar room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady despite the creeping panic inside him. Carlos pointed at the screen, where a large mass was slowly approaching their position. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a blip, an insignificant speck in the vastness of the ocean. But the readings were off. The mass wasn't moving like anything natural. It was too large, too still. "It's getting closer," Carlos muttered, his brow furrowing. "But it's not a ship. There's no sign of any propulsion. It's just there." James leaned over the console, his mind racing. A massive object, approaching them without explanation. No ship, no waves, just an immobile, enormous mass drifting toward them. And it was moving too quickly. Could it be a whale? Fiona asked, though there was no conviction in her voice. She knew better than anyone that this wasn't the behavior of any creature they had ever studied. "No," James replied, his voice cold. "This isn't natural. It's something else." The radar screen began to blink faster, indicating the mass was now closing in at an alarming rate. Whatever it wasn't merely floating, it was coming toward them. Faster and faster. "Is it a submarine?" Carlos asked, his voice filled with unease. "No," James said, his mind still working through the possibilities. "We'd be picking up signals from it. There's nothing like that out there." As the mass grew closer, something shifted in the water. The Orion shook violently, the hull groaning under the pressure. The crew scrambled to stay steady, their hands gripping anything they could find as the ship rocked back and forth. And then, without warning, the water around them exploded. The massive shape rose from the depths in a burst of foam, a towering form that dwarfed the ship. The roar of the sea was deafening, and for a split second, James thought the entire ocean had risen to swallow them whole. The creature that emerged from the depths was nothing like they had ever seen, no whale, no sea serpent. It was something ancient, something unfathomable. Its form was vast and shapeless, a collection of undulating tendrils and shifting masses that seemed to blend seamlessly with the water. It was dark, darker than the blackest night, and its surface shimmered with an oily sheen, as though the very ocean was alive within it. For a brief moment, the creature loomed over them, its enormous bulk casting a shadow that blocked out the sun, turning day into night. Its tendrils twisted and coiled around the ship, dragging the Orion into its grasp. The ship groaned under the strain, and the crew screamed in terror as they struggled to hold on. Then, without any warning, the creature released them. The Orion was thrown violently to the side, its engine sputtering in a desperate attempt to maintain course. But the ship was no match for the creature's power. It wasn't just a physical force that had attacked them, it was something older, something primal, a force that had no need for reason or explanation. The ocean had released its wrath upon them, and it had only just begun. "What the hell is that?" Carlos gasped, staring out at the creature, which was now slipping back beneath the surface. "I don't know," James said, his voice thick with disbelief. "But whatever it is, it's not done with us." The crew watched in stunned silence as the creature retreated into the ocean, leaving behind only a churning vortex of water. The ship's engines were still struggling, barely keeping them afloat. The water around them seemed to ripple with the echoes of something ancient, something beyond comprehension. "We need to get out of here," Fiona said, her voice shaking. "This place is cursed. It's alive. And we've woken it." But it was already too late. From beneath the waves, something else began to stir. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the ship's hull and deep into their bones. The sound was not of any animal, nor any force of nature they had ever encountered. It was something alive, something that had been waiting in the depths of the ocean for centuries. The hum turned into a growl, a deep, resonating noise that seemed to vibrate the very air around them. "Brace yourselves," James shouted, his voice filled with urgency. But before anyone could react, the Orion was struck again, this time harder, sending the crew flying across the deck. The creature, whatever it was not finished. It was coming for them, and there was no place to hide. The sea had become its realm, and the crew of the Orion had wandered too deep into its territory. James looked into the water, knowing that the abyss was no longer just a place beneath them. It was all around them. And in the distance, the creature's glowing eyes watched, waiting for its next strike. Chapter 9: The Forgotten Island. The Orion was no longer a ship, it was a wreck. After the encounter with the massive creature from the depths, the crew had done everything they could to keep the ship afloat. The beast had nearly capsized them, but they had managed to escape, barely. The ship was limping now, its hull cracked and its engines sputtering. The ocean, which had been their vessel's domain, had become a nightmare they could no longer control. The sky above them had turned dark, heavy clouds swirling ominously overhead as if the heavens themselves were conspiring against them. The horizon stretched out endlessly, an empty, oppressive void that seemed to press in on them from every direction. The water around the ship was dark, the waves sluggish, almost as if the very sea had lost its energy, drained by the creatures that dwelled beneath. "Captain," Fiona said, her voice barely audible over the creaking of the ship. "We can't keep going like this. We need to find land. We need shelter." James stood at the helm, gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He knew she was right. The ship could not survive much longer in the state it was in. They had to find land, but the vast ocean had become a treacherous maze, and there was no telling what other horrors lurked just beneath the surface. "Keep scanning the horizon," James said, his voice steady despite the dread gnawing at him. "We can't afford to stay in these waters any longer." The crew was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The terror they had experienced was too much for anyone to bear. The encounter with the sea serpent, the wailing souls trapped beneath the lighthouse, the ancient, undulating beast, they had all left deep scars, and no one was sure how much more they could endure. Hours passed, and then, just as hope seemed to fade, Carlos shouted from the radar room. "Captain! Land! There's land ahead!" James's heart leapt in his chest. Land. It was a beacon of salvation, something solid in the endless expanse of water. Even if it was just a barren rock, it would be enough to escape the ocean's grip. Full speed ahead, James ordered. The crew rallied together, working frantically to navigate the battered Orion toward the landmass on the horizon. As they drew closer, the shape of the island became clearer, a jagged, blackened silhouette rising from the water. It was small, isolated, and eerily quiet, but it was land. And for the crew of the Orion, it was their only chance for survival. The ship scraped against the rocky shore with a groan as the engines struggled to maintain their power. The crew rushed to disembark, eager to leave the sinking ship behind. They climbed into the dinghy, silently paddling toward the island, the weight of their past horrors pressing down on them. When they reached the shore, they pulled the dinghy up onto the sand and stood there for a moment, looking at the desolate island. The air was thick with humidity, and the land seemed to stretch in all directions, its surface uneven and rocky. There were no signs of life, no trees, no animals, nothing to indicate that this place had ever been inhabited. "This doesn't feel right," Fiona said, her voice low. James nodded, his instincts telling him the same. The island was isolated, forgotten, as though it had been abandoned by the world long ago. It was a place that should not exist on any map, a place that time had erased. "We don't have a choice," James said, his voice hardening. "We need to find shelter. There's no other option." They moved inland, the ground beneath them uneven and treacherous. The air was thick with moisture, the heat oppressive, but they pressed on. The island, though barren, had an almost ancient feel to it, as though it was older than anything they had ever encountered. As they ventured further into the island, they noticed strange markings on the rocks. Carvings, worn by time, but still visible if you looked closely. The symbols were unfamiliar, intricate, twisting patterns that seemed to pulse with a hidden energy. The crew stopped to examine them, but as soon as they did, the wailing sound from the ocean seemed to echo through the air. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, more distinct. The same mournful cry they had heard on the Wailing Coast, the same wail that had driven them to the brink of madness. This place is cursed," Carlos whispered, his voice trembling. "It's the same sound. It's coming from here." James's heart sank. He had hoped, he had prayed, that this island would be their refuge. But the wail, the unmistakable sound of tormented souls, filled the air once again. It wasn't just an echo from the ocean, it was here, beneath them, around them, as if the island itself was alive with the sorrow of those long lost. The crew pressed on, but now they were moving with purpose, their every step quickened by fear. They needed to find shelter, and fast. The wail grew louder with each passing second, an agonizing sound that clawed at their minds, dragging them into despair. After what felt like an eternity, they came across a cave, its entrance hidden behind thick vines and overgrown vegetation. It was small, but it was a place to rest, a place to hide from the horrors that had chased them across the seas. As they entered the cave, the wail reached a deafening crescendo. It felt as though the island itself was closing in on them, suffocating them with the weight of its secrets. But there was no turning back now. They were trapped, and whatever forces had brought them here would not let them leave. They huddled together inside the cave, waiting for the storm to pass, but there was no storm. The only storm was the one inside their minds, the growing terror that they were not alone on this forgotten island. The wail reverberated through the walls of the cave, a constant reminder of the ancient, malevolent force that lay beneath the surface. And then, they heard it. A voice, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, whispered from the darkness. "Join us." James's blood ran cold. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking. But there was no answer, only the sound of the wail, louder now, as if the very earth itself were calling to them. The crew looked around, their eyes wide with fear. They were not alone on this island. Something ancient, something powerful, was waiting for them. And it wasn't just the wailing souls of the ocean that they had to fear. The island itself was alive, alive with memories, with curses, with a dark history that had been buried for centuries. The wail grew louder, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. And then, the walls of the cave began to crack open. Chapter 10: The Return of the Tide. The walls of the cave groaned as cracks began to spread, thin lines of light seeping through from the outside. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the wailing, that constant, agonizing cry, grew louder still, echoing through the earth. The crew huddled together, trying to make sense of the horrifying realization that whatever forces had led them to this forgotten island were now closing in. The whispers came again, soft at first, like the wind pushing through the cracks in the cave. "Join us." The voice was ancient, an echo of something lost to time, but it was clear in its intent. Something was beckoning them from the depths of the island, urging them closer, as if there were no escape from its grasp. James could feel his heart racing, his breath shallow. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from fear. We need to leave," Fiona said, her eyes wide with panic. "We need to get back to the boat, now." But the island seemed to have other plans. The very air was thick with something old, something that had been waiting. The wail rose and fell like a tidal wave, and the very earth beneath them felt like it was alive, pulsing with energy, as if it was pulling them toward the center of the island. "Get out," James ordered, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "We need to make a run for it." But as they turned to leave, the entrance of the cave collapsed. Rocks tumbled from above, blocking their only exit. The island had sealed them in, its grip tightening with every passing second. They were trapped. "God, no," Carlos gasped, his hands scrabbling at the fallen rocks, but it was useless. The cave was now a tomb, and they were its prisoners. "Please," Fiona whispered, her voice breaking as she turned to face the others. "What is happening to us?" James swallowed, his mind racing. The ancient curse of the island, the wailing voices, the disturbing carvings on the rocks, all of it was leading to this moment. The island had awakened, and it was not just alive, it was alive with memories, with vengeance, and it was determined to claim them. They backed away from the collapsed entrance, stumbling in the darkness as the ground continued to tremble. The wail was no longer just a sound, it was a force, an unrelenting presence that seemed to move through the cave walls, vibrating the very bones in their bodies. Then, a sudden burst of light illuminated the cave. The crevices in the rock had widened, revealing the faintest glimpse of the island outside. And in that light, they saw it. The source of the wailing. At first, it was only a shadow, a shifting form in the distance. But as their eyes adjusted, they saw it clearly, a figure, tall and twisted, its body made of the very rock of the island itself, as if it had been carved from the earth over millennia. Its eyes were glowing, dark and hollow, like two empty pits that seemed to devour the light around them. It was not human. It was not alive, but it was something much older, something from a time before humanity had even existed. It stepped forward, and the ground beneath them shook with its movements. Its form was shifting, like molten stone, but it had a presence, a power that made the very air feel thick with dread. And as it moved, the wailing grew louder, an orchestra of suffering that filled their ears, rattled their skulls, and pressed against their hearts. The figure reached out with a hand made of rock, its fingers curling toward them. "Join us," it whispered again, its voice not of words, but of the very earth itself, A voice that seemed to come from the land, from the ocean, from the depths of time. James staggered back, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a curse, it was an ancient pact, a binding, something that had been waiting for centuries, for millennia. The souls of the damned, trapped within the island, had called to them, and now the island itself had claimed them. No! James shouted, but his voice was drowned by the roar of the wail, the endless cry of souls that could never rest. With a sudden, violent jolt, the island's power surged. The ground split open again, wider this time, revealing the vast abyss beneath. The cave trembled as the earth split further, and from the depths, the return of the tide was clear. The ocean, once calm, once still, began to rise again. It wasn't just the waves, it was the water itself, as if the island had drawn the entire ocean into its depths. The sea surged toward them, its waves towering above, its power growing with every second. "Get to the shore!" Fiona screamed, but it was too late. The island was sinking, the earth opening up as the ocean rushed in. The water surged, claiming the land, drowning the island whole. The figure, the wailing souls, the island itself, all of it was being pulled into the depths, to be forgotten, to be buried once again. But it wasn't enough. The tide was not just pulling them toward the ocean, it was pulling them toward the heart of the abyss. The water surged higher, drowning the island as it swallowed everything in its path. The very ocean, which had once been their source of refuge, now turned against them. It was a force too powerful to comprehend, too ancient to defeat. The crew fought to stay afloat, but the sea was relentless. The water rose higher, filling the cave, swallowing them whole. And as James felt the icy grip of the ocean close around him, he heard it once more, the wail. It wasn't just the sound of the damned. It was the sound of the ocean itself, a deep, resonating cry from the heart of the earth. The curse had come full circle. The island, the souls, the creatures from the depths, all of it was part of the same ancient force. And now, it was taking everything back. In the final moments, as the water consumed them, James realized the truth. The ocean wasn't just a force of nature, it was alive, an ancient being, a consciousness that had existed long before humanity. It had claimed them, just as it had claimed everything before them. This chapter brings the crew's journey to a tragic and inevitable end, as the ancient island and its curse return the crew to the depths of the ocean. The wailing voices, the dark forces, and the overwhelming power of the sea culminate in their final moments of terror. And as the darkness closed in, he knew there would be no escape. The ocean's grip was final. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.